We're going to record, George.
All right, fire away.
Good morning. My name is Tim Keenan. I'm the board member of the Cypress Chamber of Commerce, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our networking breakfast for April 13th, 2021. Thank you for being here. We have an interesting program today. We think it should be a special program. We always like to start off our program by thanking our presenting sponsor for our breakfast. Our presenting sponsor for our monthly networking breakfast is Kinetic Mortgage. Kinetic Mortgage is your premier independent mortgage broker in Cypress. They just need one credit report to find you the best mortgage rates and prepare personalized loan options for almost any budget. And of course, events like this wouldn't be possible without our sponsors. We also have a couple door prizes I know about. So if you hang on to the end of the meeting, then you're eligible for some door prizes. So we have two guest speakers who are going to be joining us today. They're going to tag team. And I don't know what order they're going to go in, but I'm going to introduce Atty Mclellan first. Atty Mclellan is the Community Engagement Manager of United to End Homelessness for Orange County United Way. It's an initiative that convenes various stakeholders, including businesses, nonprofits, and faith-based organizations to build a community-wide collaboration to end homelessness in Orange County. And joining Atty is Chelsea Bowers. She currently serves as the Communications Director at CityNet, a homeless service and housing agency. CityNet has been a partner with the City of Cypress and the Cypress Police Department since 2017 and has worked with various community partners and resources within the City of Cypress to connect over 200 individuals and families to HUD qualifying housing options. So they're both going to share some of their updates on what's going on in Orange County and West Orange County with the homeless situation. And we're probably going to start with Atty. Atty, I'll let you go first.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, first off, thank you all so much for having us. I'm going to share my screen. And so really, as was stated, I'll sort of talk about the broader Orange County state of homelessness, provide some overall best practices for how homelessness is addressed across the country, and give some data about what Orange County is spending on homelessness and what Orange County could save in regards to addressing homelessness, since this is I'm sure many folks here are very business minded. And so we just want to share some of those facts with you. So that being said, when we're talking about addressing homelessness, most people are familiar with this staircase. This is called the treatment model. This is what most people are familiar of when we talk about homelessness. However, under the second Bush administration, a new model to address homelessness was put forward. And this new model was called Housing First. And a Housing First idea is that we want to end someone's homelessness as quickly as possible by housing them with wraparound services to make sure that they stay stably housed, that they're safely housed, and that they're successful in that housing. So that is now considered a national best practice to addressing this issue of homelessness. And research across the country has shown that this model actually decreases the amount of times that someone goes into the hospital and the amount of time they spend in the hospital. It decreases someone's interaction with law enforcement, and it decreases the amount of time that someone spends on our street, which shows to save communities across the country quite a bit of money. And we'll get into Orange County numbers here in a few slides. So when we're talking about homelessness in our community, so every 2 years, HUD has communities across the country do this big push to count who's experiencing homelessness in their community. So the last data that we have for Orange County is from 2019. And this is just a quick look at what that countywide data looked like in 2019. So there were 6,860 people counted as experiencing homelessness in our community. 677 seniors, the majority of which were sleeping on our streets, so they were not in a shelter or a transitional housing program. 311 veterans at that time, and 466 families with 966 children included in that family number. We also found that the majority of people who are experiencing homelessness in our community, they are from our community. So 73% of people had their last permanent address in Orange County. And we also found, the data also found that over half of people had family in Orange County, over half of people were attending or did attend school in Orange County, and over 72% of people had worked or were currently working in Orange County. So when we talk and when we look at why do people fall into homelessness in our community, from the UCI cost study, we see that these are the top 3 reasons why people fall into homelessness in Orange County. The first reason is they are having difficulty finding or retaining in jobs that pay a sustainable wage to live here, because I'm sure we're all aware it's a bit expensive to live in Orange County. The second reason that was found was that it's people having difficulty finding or retaining affordable housing, so housing that is affordable to that person. And the third is family issues, so divorce, a domestic violence situation, death of a family member, separation, etc. And if you're really quick, if you're looking at those and you're saying those percentages add up to over 100%, that's because in this study, people could choose multiple reasons for what was causing their homelessness. So I promised you we would talk about costs of homelessness in Orange County. So just really quick to sort of get the blood going in the morning, I want folks here to guess how much money was spent on homelessness in Orange County in 1 year, and specifically between 2014 and 2015. How much money do people think was spent on homelessness in Orange County? I can start,
50 million.
50 million? Do people think higher than 50 million or lower than 50 million?
By whom?
It's collective. So this is including fire departments. This is including hospital costs. This is a very cumulative number. Do we think higher or lower than 100 million?
Higher.
Higher?
Lower.
Do we think higher? Oh, someone said lower. Do we think higher, lower than 150 million?
Lower than 50.
Lower than, okay, I'm just gonna spoil it. So in 1 year, our community spent $299 million. Yes, $299 million. This is including taxpayer dollars. And so a big question people ask is, well, where was this money being spent? And so when we looked at where this money was being spent, we saw that the majority of it was being spent by our cities, by fire departments, police departments, etc. But if we look at it in clusters, so what cluster was having the most amount of money spent, it was hospital costs, because and it was people who had disabling conditions having to go into the ER because their health is getting worse and worse and worse, and they're staying in hospital beds for long periods of time, etc. So this number is from the UCI cost study, and they were able to calculate how much money it costs our community for one person experiencing homelessness to stay on our streets. So they were able to calculate that number. And then they were also able to figure out what our community could save if we were to house that person through a housing first response that I mentioned earlier. And so they found that for someone who is chronically homeless, it costs our community per person per year over $100,000 for one person experiencing chronic homelessness, which means they have been experiencing homelessness for a year or longer, and they have a disabling condition, for that person to stay on our street every year. They also found that if we were to house that same person in housing that would connect them to resources that would help their health stabilize and help keep them housed, that cost goes down to by almost 50%, goes down to $51,587 per person per year. We also see that people who have the most vulnerable health conditions, who have the most complicated health conditions that are in and out of the hospital, it costs our community just under $440,000 per person per year for these folks to stay on our streets. But when these people are housed and they have access once again to that preventative health resources, that cost goes down to $55,343 per person per year.
Interesting, those costs separated, housing and support.
Well, they're together. I'll pop the report that these numbers came from into the chat box so you can read the full thing. And they also found that if we were to house all of Orange County's chronically homeless, our community could save $42 million per a year. And that does not mean I can write you a refund check for $42 million. I wish I could. It would solve quite a bit of problems if I had that ability. But we are talking about different cost savings opportunities. So we're talking about the certain cities having police officers that are designated to address this issue of homelessness. But if we were to house and get rid of some encampments by housing people in these cities, they would be able to redesignate those time and effort and money to addressing other issues that the community has. And so when we're talking about homelessness, it is possible to end homelessness. And we know this because other communities have done it. So 3 states and 82 communities have ended veterans homelessness. You can see Utah, Central Florida, and Houston have all seen significant progress in addressing this issue in their communities. And the Riverside is actually the first and only community in California to have addressed this, to have ended veterans homelessness. And they all did it by operating with a housing first model and making that decision to end homelessness. And so really quick, just to talk about how you can get involved in helping us address this issue. We do public awareness work. So this information I shared is a 2-hour class. So if you are interested in taking that class, you can follow us on Facebook, on social media to stay connected to the work that we're doing. You can also join our Housing Champions work, where we try to talk to city councils about this issue in an informed manner. And you can also sign our petition by texting homeless to 50503, which is basically saying that you support a housing first approach to addressing this issue of ending homelessness in Orange County. And we also have our landlord engagement program called Welcome Home OC, where we work with property owners who have a vacant unit and try to make sure that they feel supported and have the support they need, like security deposit, holding fees, etc., to take and accept someone who has a housing voucher that's about to expire. And then these are our different social media handles. And with that, I will pass the mic over to Chelsea to talk and share with us some information.
Awesome. Thanks, Addie. So like she said, my name's Chelsea. I work for a nonprofit called CityNet. I've been working with CityNet for almost 4 years now. And my first couple months on the job, I actually met Addie out in the field. We were hired by the County of Orange in mid-2017 to address the flood control channel that lined the Santa Ana bike trail between Angel Stadium and the Honda Center. And if you can believe it, it was about 3 to 4 miles long of tent encampments with over 600 individuals living unsheltered along that trail. It was a really big task. It was my first entrance into homeless services. We rented a RV and drove it on and off the channel every day, facilitating street outreach and case management, and connected over 200 people to different shelter opportunities before that encampment was cleared. The report that Addie is going to share with you all does touch on some of the elements of law enforcement, the role it plays, the impact that it plays on public services. And I witnessed the fire department being called almost every single day down to that flood control channel, just because there were so many health issues, especially during the summer months when it was hot and dehydration. It was a really big deal. And so in December 2017, we were brought on to Cypress through the North Orange County Public Safety Task Force. This task force is funding that comes down from the state, and it's given to police departments because all the police departments in North Orange County were experiencing an increase of call for services. They were, holding the burden of responding to these homeless related calls. And so the police departments shared that grant money through the task force and gave it to different community-based organizations, and we were one of them. So we are not funded necessarily through, city dollars, but rather this task force, which is a 4-year grant, and it ends in July of this year. So with that, I want to share a little bit about our programs. So all the way, looking back last year, these are all the different programs that we have been offering. We started off as a grassroots organization, facilitating outreach through volunteers. And then we recognized, especially when the mental health component and medical components and things like that were discovered, we needed professional help. And so we have now a really robust team of trained outreach and engagement staff that have lived experience and can build rapport. They have been there, they can talk the language, and that is such an asset when you're trying to build trust with people who are unhoused and may have been burned by the system in the past. We have housing navigators that work with programs like Welcome Home OC to get people into housing and follow their journey once they've been housed for up to a year. That includes teaching them occupational skills, how to take care of their apartment and keep it clean, manage relationships with their neighbors and landlords. Our housing navigators can help them, get that skill back if they've lost those social skills along the way. We help coordinate censuses on a city level and on a more regional level. So those 2019 numbers that Atty mentioned, CityNet was contracted by the County of Orange to facilitate the point in time count, which is a count and survey of our neighbors who are unsheltered or living in the emergency shelters that we have in OC. A program not listed that launched in 2021 was the Community Care Response Team. This is a pilot project. It's a 6-month pilot project in the city of Anaheim. And basically, we are becoming the dispatch center for the city of Anaheim. And within the first 4 months of working within the city of Anaheim, we have redirected close to 3,000 calls for service related to homelessness to our staff. So we are taking out that middleman, not having police departments respond to homeless related calls, businesses that are complaining of, maybe someone is sleeping underneath their threshold and they don't want them to, be arrested, but they want a compassionate response. Or perhaps someone is having a mental health episode. We have licensed clinical social workers on our staff that are gonna be the first responders to those calls, which is powerful. So something that happened in 2020 is our COVID-19 response, which I have a quick video Atty will pull up for us. But essentially, what happened in 2020, it was unprecedented and we still operated, and were part of our funding that kind of kept us operating was COVID-19 funding from the state and other sources. And so we were able to do public education, which the video will show. We operated emergency quarantine sites through motel conversions, supported the County of Orange with Project Room Key and Home Key and Tool Belt, which are, different levels of people who moved off the street into different housing options and then on to more permanent supportive housing. And so this video will kind of paint a picture of what our outreach and engagement looks like in the city of Cypress and in the greater Orange County area.
As an essential service during the COVID-19 crisis, one of our main goals and responsibilities as a service provider is to be out here in the communities. Because of the COVID pandemic, this population is extremely vulnerable, and if they were to contract the illness, we want to make sure that they are educated on what resources are available to them.
A lot of our clients right now are struggling with getting access to food and water. A lot of the resource centers or churches among the community have closed.
We came out today to provide resources, support, and supplies such as personal protective equipment, masks, hand sanitizers, food and water, but also taking that a step farther and ultimately connecting them to helpful and useful resources such as shelter, permanent housing, connections to different kinds of programs, and also to continue keeping our communities that we serve safe.
Thanks, Atty. So hopefully that video paints a really great picture of the work that's taking place behind the scenes. We have staff spread out all across Orange County, and CityNet's programs stretch all the way up to Santa Barbara, Redondo Beach, Corona, and Riverside. So what that outreach looks like in Cypress, through the North Orange County Public Safety Task Force, that funding allows for 2 case managers to work in your city every Friday from 7 a.m. to 12. So sometimes we deploy with your law enforcement team, other times it's on our own. And on the last slide, there's contact information that you can provide anyone who is experiencing homelessness. That's our Orange County outreach line phone number. And perhaps post-COVID, we can figure out how to get you outreach cards. But that is a little quick summary of what our programs look like in Cypress.
Cool. Thank you. Did you have any wrap up comments you wanted to make before we start asking questions, or you guys, that was it? Cool. The one thing I contacted the police department and we tried to get a representative to join us today, but I called too late at the last minute to get somebody, just to sort of get, maybe after you finish, to get their perspective on it. But that's great that you're actually working with them interactively. So I'll start off the questions, because one of the things that was pretty prominent when you talk about the thing by Angel Stadium, and the first thing they started with was a survey. And sort of the remarkable part of the survey was that 80% of the people who were there said, no, we don't want housing. We love urban camping, as they called it, and we want to stay out here under the stars. Were you able to convert many of those, that 80% of the homeless at that time, that initial survey? This is what that initial survey was. And then this is before they got Judge Carter involved and all that. They said, let's go survey everybody and kind of get a feel for where they are. Do you feel like you were able to convert a lot of those people, or what do you think, since you were hands-on there?
Yeah, so I think I'm pretty sure the story that you're referencing is the sheriff department facilitated a survey at the very beginning, and that was right before we got hired. And so when the sheriff department was facilitating the survey to try to figure out, what's the best approach to addressing this issue, a lot of people probably told them no, right? But then we facilitated, CityNet, right when we started in January 2017, facilitated our own survey, and it was night and day, the response. And I think, perhaps it's intimidating for some people, to have a law enforcement officer in full uniform show up asking you intrusive questions versus someone like Atty and myself, or a social worker, right, that is trained on how to ask questions with empathy and ask questions with no judgment, right? And the results were, people wanted help, they just didn't know how to do it.
Yeah.
And then I'm just gonna Chelsea, I'm gonna piggyback off as well, because this is something that gets asked frequently. And so Chelsea, referencing the survey that CityNet did as well, I think over 80% of people of the survey said, yes, we do want help to end our homelessness. And so what we see, which is very common in a lot of different communities, is when agencies who have two different sets of resources both ask the same group of people, do you want help? They sometimes come away with those two different answers. And so like Chelsea was saying, we see that the response with the sheriff's department, they had one set of resources, and so they got one set of answers to their question, do you want help? While CityNet, who has a different set of resources that they're able to connect people to, they asked that same question and they got a much different response. So just sort of, Chelsea, piggybacking off of what you were saying, it's very common. We see that a lot in communities, of that those two different resources really make a difference.
Mm-hmm. And that program that I mentioned that just launched this year in Anaheim, I mean, it sits on the premise that we need a different person at the table being the first person to respond to these calls. If someone is not, being a harm to themselves or others, or they're not, breaking the law, and they're just, sleeping in a park because they have nowhere else to go, law enforcement doesn't need to respond to that. Their mission is public safety, and they have other calls that they need to respond to. And there's actually data, like some of our success rates is measured based on our response rate. So if the police department took 3 to 4 hours to respond to a complaint call where someone was sleeping in a park and a family was concerned about it, they called the police department. It took them 3 to 4 hours to respond. It takes us within 30 minutes. So that is also like cost savings, where law enforcement, needs to continue to do their job. And there are other resources that can respond to those type of calls.
Absolutely. I mean, anytime we can get, an alternative resource that's not as expensive as having a police department respond to something like that, I think that's a highly, valuable thing.
I have a question about effectiveness.
I have one more question, Shelley, before you go into that. So effectiveness, kind of to follow up on that. So at the sort of the end of that process, you can't provide housing for everybody because that's an incentive for people to be homeless in a way. So what about the final step of getting them out of the homelessness trap? You know, whether it's mental health or drug addiction or whatever. Sure, you've got them sheltered, but how do you get them back into society? That's the word. How do you get them back into society so that they're not a burden, and so we're not incentivizing future homelessness?
Chelsea, do you want to take this one first, or do you want to?
Yeah, I can. So I think you're referencing the cycle of homelessness, and there are stats out there where people do tend to fall into homelessness, you know, more than once. It's kind of like domestic violence. People exit a domestic violence relationship and then they find themselves down the line in a relationship that is not right, right? So for those who are moving off the street and into housing, that journey is different for everyone. Sometimes we can get them housing within a month. Sometimes they're on a waiting list for a year or two. And it just really depends on what vouchers are available, what resources are available, and how they're adapting to change. I think for Cypress, you have to lean on your neighboring cities to house someone. We track where people go, and most of the street exits in Cypress, they're going to a shelter in Anaheim, they're going to a shelter in Buena Park. So when you take someone out of the community they were born and raised in, they went to high school here, and then you take them to another community, that's a lot of change for someone. And so along with that, I think, Atty, you could probably speak to this too. Mental health resources are limited, but they're growing. And one example of that is the County of Orange just opened up ULOC, a mental health clinic that is located in the City of Orange. And I'm so excited to see how that impacts our community here. I think it's just going to be a game changer because mental health is a growing conversation and it affects almost every single one of our clients.
And then piggybacking off of sort of this conversation. So when we talk about how does someone go from homeless to housed in our community, we need to look at our system of care. And so we do this in the 2-hour class. So like I said, the content I was able to cover in the presentation, it was a lot of things had to we aren't able to get into the details all the time. But in our class, we talk about the coordinated entry system. And so this is basically a system where people who are experiencing homelessness, they need to get into that system in order to be connected to that resource that will help end their homelessness. So that voucher. And so when we're talking about ending homelessness, it's important to recognize that if someone has certain barriers and they're experiencing homelessness, as soon as that person is housed, they are by definition no longer homeless. And that's not to say other resources to help address those barriers are not part of the conversation. They are such a crucial part of keeping someone safe and successful from when they are experiencing homelessness to when they are in housing. But what we see when someone enters our coordinated entry system, they aren't able to exit. They get stuck in our system because we don't have enough resources coming in. We don't have enough housing. We don't have enough vouchers being made available. There's just not enough. And so people end up waiting in our system for days, for months, for multiple months, for I don't think years in this case, but they wait a long periods of time. And so when you're driving past someone on your way to the grocery store and you see someone who's on the street who looks visibly homeless, that person might have made the choice, they made the call, they took the assessment to get into our coordinated entry system, and they're still waiting. So that's what we see in our system in terms of, it's not necessarily that people don't want help. That's not necessarily, that can be a complicated conversation. But when we look at the behaviors of our system, we see that people get stuck because there's not enough exits. So that's sort of that broad system. That's what we see when we look at that broad system level of things.
Makes sense. Yeah. Shelley, you had a question?
I was going to ask if you have information about, well, for the lack of a better word, recidivism. how effective, if someone gets unstuck and gets that help and they get into transitional housing and they have all of the resources that are available to them, they get stood up again, dusted off, a job is found for them. What's the percentage, some kind of information on whether they end up back out in a cardboard box?
Yeah, like how if they fall back into homelessness, what's that? That's a very good question. So when we look, and so transitional housing is a bit different than these permanent housing solutions, because a transitional housing program has a time limit. So it can be anywhere from 6 months to 24 months. So that looks a bit different than a permanent housing option, which can be either rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing. And those two housing responses are for two different populations who have two different needs. So when we look at these housing responses, we see very high retention rates. So in 2019, 98% of the people who were housed through permanent housing remained housed, 98%. And in 2020, it was 99% of the people who were in those permanent housing solutions remained housed. So we see very high retention rates once someone gets into housing, because that housing really can help with that stability, and having those services help keep that person in that housing. And it can be very difficult to get into that housing. So people tend to stay. And we also see the UCI cost study found that these troublesome issues we typically associate with homelessness, they tend to dissipate once someone's been housed. So there's a 100% reduction in the amount of times that someone is arrested once they've been housed. There's a 78% reduction that someone goes into the rides an ambulance, I believe. And there's a 43% reduction in the amount of times that someone goes into the ER. So we see these behavior changes with that provision of housing. So Chelsea, I don't know if you have anything to add or want to get, yeah.
I was pulling up a document because we just were drafting a story for one of our neighboring cities, and we talked about some of the investment of time that it took to get someone from street to home. And so this gentleman has been experiencing homelessness for over 10 years. It took 14 conversations, we call them interactions, but 14 conversations with this individual for him to even say, okay, I'm interested in getting off the street. That's that trust and rapport we're talking about. That's like, do you have something to eat today? Do you want a water? Like, can you trust us with your most intimate details of your life so we can help you? That's that 14 interactions. Once he said yes, it took 94 hours of case management. And that's just what was recorded. We all know data is a little bit under, right? So that's like, let's get you an ID. Let's fill out that DMV form. Let's find your birth certificate and social security card again because you lost it along the way. You need all that, getting document ready in order to get into more permanent supportive housing. Once he was housed, it was 61 hours invested in getting him stabilized. So our case managers actually had to work with him to go from sleeping on his carpet to getting in a bed because he just was not ready to sleep on a bed. He had been sleeping on the floor for so many years. So that's like trauma that someone has to work through once they're housed. So, I mean, he went to the emergency room so many times, but it went down to one time once he was housed. So it was like 6 times a year to now once. So it's just a huge, huge decrease in some of those public resources once he was housed.
That's amazing. Wow. What a time commitment. I mean, it's huge.
But I'm further interested. I mean, he's housed, right? When does he become independent? I mean, it's got to be, I am incredibly happy that he and others like him have improved that far, but he has to take the final step and become self-sufficient, or he's drawing resources from somewhere in perpetuity, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so really quick, I apologize for going over our Q&A time, but we talk about this in the Homelessness 101 class where we pull apart these definitions of homelessness. So there's chronic, and then there's what we call non-chronic homelessness. And for people who are chronically homeless, they have been homeless for a year or longer, and they have a disabling condition. So for folks like that, they might need that support that's not going away, because that disabling condition might not go away. That health condition might not go away. So they need that continued support. But for someone who's non-chronically homeless, that response looks different, because they might need those barriers to that housing minimized for them. So they might need help with that security deposit and have those utilities on. But then after 3 months, they're able to pay that rent themselves, or they're able to get connected to a higher paying job. So when we're talking about the amount of time someone needs that assistance, it's going to look different for different groups of people who have different needs. So it can get more complicated of who needs that assistance, who doesn't, when we talk about different groups and their needs.
In Southern California, that first and last month's rent just to get into an apartment can be an enormous hurdle.
Yes. Yep.
I have a question, if I may.
Yes, George, go ahead.
We've always traditionally thought of public housing as large, separate facilities, modest, housing dozens, if not hundreds of people in modest facilities. Is that model gone now? Is that old? I mean, now we're trying to go like a Section 8, getting people into regular housing facilities and financing the tab.
Yeah. Our housing system in America really looks different than those public housing models you saw, with Cabrini Green and Pruitt-Igoe. It looks very different now. So it is more of that emphasis on vouchers. So when we're talking about homelessness and we're talking about housing being built, when we like to really point out and talk about permanent supportive housing, because most people aren't familiar with that. And permanent supportive housing does not look like public housing. We have permanent supportive housing being in Orange County in many different cities. There's one in Anaheim called the Rockwood that was built by Jamboree Housing. It's been in the community since 2016, and it is all for people who were formerly homeless. And that includes families, that includes individuals, etc. And it looks just like any regular apartment complex that you'd see when you're driving in Orange County. And so, and it looks very different. So you don't see those big blocks being built, and you don't see, and when we talk about public housing, there weren't services connected to that public housing, and the public housing that was built, there's a lot going on there. But with permanent supportive housing, people are being connected to services, people are being connected to their community, they have that support, and they're signing that lease agreement that saying you will follow these things, you are agreeing to what a regular renter would agree to, and then they have that support to help make sure that they follow that lease agreement. In terms of vouchers, we also, with other responses, we see people being housed in these private market units. And once again, having that support with them to make sure they're successful in that. So that's more what we see. We don't really see that public housing as here. We just don't see that.
It's a business question. I mean, does the housing, the landlords say that there's a contract different? What kind of support, long-time support does that agreement include? Yeah.
I can speak more to our Welcome Home with C program, and Chelsea, I don't know if you want to pop in and add anything. But we actually have Ernie Schroeder from Schroeder Management. He's been connected to the program that we have, and he said that it's actually a bit easier to have someone who has this voucher, because if there's an issue with that tenant, you're not only talking to the tenant, but you're talking to their case manager who knows them longer than a property owner might know them. You have more of a team they get to talk to and sort of problem solve. So in terms of, and he brings up, he's like, it's consistent rent, because if that housing voucher, that's going to be consistent rent from the federal government. That's a quote he said, and there's a video of that on our website. So it can look a bit different depending on the voucher. Those questions of specificities with the voucher and XYZ, that can be a more nuanced conversation. That's at least an example of what one property owner we work with, his opinion on it.
Wow.
Thank you.
Right. I think I'm gonna, if anybody else has questions, I'll provide a resource for you to contact these folks so we can get on to the networking portion of this. But thank you both for attending, and thanks for putting together that presentation. That was really good. Yes, round of applause. That'd be great.
regional issues as well. So thank you for having me, and I'll be here till probably around 10 o'clock. But thanks, everyone.
Cool, thank you. Next is Shirley. Are you back? Are you available to give a presentation? Not sure. I want to go to Shelley Henderson because Shelley was at the council meeting or attended online there, or I'm not sure exactly how you attended the council meeting last night, Shelley, but had some interesting information that she'd like to share.
I was on the, I was virtual, but the council itself was in chambers except for the mayor pro tem. It was the first time they've been back in the council chambers in quite a while. The interesting information is regarding the summer concerts that the city had to cancel last summer because of the COVID lockdown. They will be having, and they are delighted about it, they will be having summer concerts this year, and the Salute to America. They're following a drive-in model like they had last fall with movies. So they are negotiating with Cypress College for dates. They will be all Fridays. The Salute to America will be consolidated with one of the concerts on July 2nd. So there will be music first, followed by fireworks. And they are there was practically dancing in the aisles at the city council meeting